And I'm live. Hello. Hi, I'm Professor Patti with Cleveland State University, and I am creating content for my 626 course. And this is week 2. We're reading chapter 3 of Skills in Neighborhood Work by Paul Henderson and David Thomas. And this is from the MSAS library from 2002. And today we're talking about chapter 3, getting to know the neighborhood. If you're in my course, this is available to you in the course content. And if you're using my open educational resource textbook, there should be a copy of this available as well for your perusal. But you can always check it out from your local library, including Cleveland State University has community library privileges if you're not even a student. Getting to know the neighborhood. The phase of this work is variously referred to as fact-finding, data collection, assembling a community profile or audit, or carrying out an assessment of community needs and resources. The purpose of this work is to inform the practitioner's decisions about what issues, problems, groups, or agencies he or she will work with. The gathering of data is rarely sufficient in itself to produce change, but it is a prerequisite for planning a large number of strategies available to neighborhood workers and community groups. I want to point out that neighborhood has a U in the middle of it, which makes me think this is from the UK. Several writers have suggested that the activity of fact-finding in a neighborhood comprises the following features. Bullet point. It is specific and systematic activity that seeks to avoid haphazardness and vagueness. It is informed by purposiveness and is guided by the worker's objectives. Bullet point 2. It relates to a defined problem, issue, locality, or group, and is directly concerned with the here and now situations of community residents. Bullet point 3, it is as objective and free from bias and partiality as possible in its goals. Methods of collection and analysis. If it is, then workers must expect that sometimes their fact-finding will yield data that conflict with their own and others' impressions of the community. Bullet point 4, it is carried out with the intention of putting the findings to some use. Data gathering is not pure research or the basis of a sociological study. The worker does it in order to apply its results to what he or she has to do in the community. So this is the kind of data you're collecting you intend to disseminate to citizens and residents of the community. So that is the voice. The voice for these projects in this course is not an academic paper or theoretical paper or a presentation of the theoretical or academic understanding of the community. Why collect data? The last point suggests one of the most important reasons why neighborhood workers need to gather data before rushing into action. Data gathering promotes planning and rationality, and simultaneously informs and puts a limit on the influence of intuition in the making of decisions. Wah, wah. It is desirable that choices about what the worker is going to do, how it will be done, and the likely consequences are based on knowledge about community groups, problems, and resources. At the least, the worker will need to know what problems are to be identified in a community, how they are experienced by local people, and what motivation, skills, and resources are to be found in the community for dealing with those problems. There are a number of other reasons for data gathering in the neighborhood work. It provides a focused and comfortable way of initiating contacts with local people and service agencies. In respect of the latter, visits to agencies to gather facts and impressions about an area can provide the foundation for future work with which those agencies and their staff. The initial fact-finding phase also provides a baseline for more specific pieces of action research that may occur during later phases of the life of a community group. For instance, data gathered by the worker may be useful in specific studies of, say, land ownership, employment, housing conditions, and so forth, that a group may need to carry out in order to support its case for particular changes in the allocation of resources. The workers' data bank on the area may also be useful to community groups when they have to prepare funding applications. In addition, there are a number of administrative issues that confirm the importance of this fact-finding phase. First, the worker has a responsibility to provide a data bank on the community that will inform his or her successors. Second, it is largely through access to facts about the community that a worker supervisor will be able to judge A, that the worker is operating on the basis of knowledge and not guesswork or prejudice, and B, that there is a fit between the worker's intervention and his or her original assessment of needs and resources in the community. Thus, adequate data are a prerequisite of adequate monitoring and evaluation of the worker's activities, carried out by the worker and/or the supervisor. Additionally, the workers' and supervisors' familiarity with data about the community may often be useful in justifying and supporting some aspect of his or her work that has come under criticism. For example, a community worker wrote an article for a local newspaper which described the very poor housing conditions in a town. Some counselors were annoyed by the article and approached the worker's manager. The worker, however, was able to show that the article was based completely upon the available census data for the town. The extent of the data gathering may range from reconnaissance studies that may take only a week or so to larger scale assessments of need that can last as long as 6 to 9 months. Each worker must come to the decision about the scope and scale of fact-finding activities in the light of both the range and complexity of issues thought to be associated with the area and the worker's own circumstances. A person, for example, who is an area's first worker may have to spend considerably more time in gathering data than someone who joins a team to replace an outgoing worker. Someone who is replacing a worker will presumably have access to data already gathered. What a presumption! And in addition, may quickly become embroiled in action as she takes over the work left by her predecessor. Sorry to everyone who followed me. All right, there are several other factors that will determine workers' commitments to fact-finding, including the kinds of skills they have or don't have for handling data, and their understanding of what they have found helpful in past experience. Likewise, the amount of time given to fact-finding will vary directly with the extent to which they see their approach as rationalist, and inversely, where a worker believes in a more intuitive approach. Workers will also vary their confidence and competence to make use of computer software packages for collecting data. There is an increasing number of these, for example, Compass for Windows, which is a community profiling software package designed or produced by the Policy Research Institute. I have read this article so many times and I'm not familiar with that one. I'm looking it up. It allows users to design a questionnaire drawing on over 400 questions, input the data, and analyze it. For rural community work, the package on village appraisals developed by Countryside and Community Research Unit in Cheltenham and Gloucester College of Higher Education, 1998, is widely used. I'm bookmarking this. If you're in my course, I'm going to look for a link to this resource and try to patch it right into week 2. In determining what is the right balance between fact-finding and other early activities, such as making relationships with residents and agency colleagues, the worker will also be influenced by an awareness of some of the dangers of fact-finding. In particular, workers may be aware that gathering data can provide an inappropriate retreat from the tasks of engaging with local issues and people. There are 2 questions to be asked about data collection. What do I need to know, and how do I go about finding it out? The rest of the chapter is organized around those questions. The reader... Hi, I'm Professor Patti with Cleveland State University. Post. On TikTok, why not? A lot of these I'm putting on TikTok, Meta. Okay. What do I need to know? Finding it out. The rest of the chapter is questions. The reader is encouraged to make use of it in conjunction with Ruth Stewart's material on community auditing. See the appendix. I don't think I have the appendix. I'm finding it. All right. What do I need to know? It is possible to specify a range of subjects about which data are sought in neighborhood work. We have divided this range into 6 categories only for the purposes of analysis. In practice, they overlap, and it may be difficult for the worker to know to which category a piece of information belongs. For example, data on a powerful organization in a neighborhood are relevant both to the category called organizations and to that called power and leadership. We suggest that the following scheme be used by workers as a guide or checklist in their data gathering activities, and not as an analysis to straitjacket their own perceptions of the particular and unique community in which they find themselves working. In addition, some data about a neighborhood may only make sense within an understanding of the dynamics of the whole city or region, and data about these wider areas may also be needed. The following then are the 6 major topics about which you may want to gather data, and these are headings for the rest of the chapter. History, environment, residents, organizations, communications, power and leadership. History. Issues and problems of an area are connected to people, organizations, and events in its past. Local people are often the best sources of historical data. And contacts with them to learn more about the history of the area may develop to the extent that they become involved in organizing around a neighborhood issue. They need to understand neighborhood issues within a historical perspective has generally been underrepresented in the community work literature. Environment. The environment of an area is of interest for 2 reasons. First, it may contain some of the problems of concern to residents, such as inadequate open space, and around which they may want to organize. Second, it provides the context in which people in the area go about their work and leisure, and as such may be an important determinant of their relationships with each other. Environmental data that are relevant for the neighborhood worker include the administrative and natural boundaries of the area, the density of persons per acre, the provision of public open space, the sitting and effect of road, rail, and pedestrian facilities, the volume and nature of road traffic, land usage in the area, and the interaction and balance between industrial, commercial, and residential uses, the presence of derelict and undeveloped sites and buildings will also be something to be noted. Beside their impact on the environment, they may later prove to be a useful resource. The extent and nature of recreational facilities, the design and layout of streets and estates and the way in which they affect residential life, the extent and content of residents' own destructive and creative attempts at changing the environment through activities like vandalism, graffiti, murals, and fly posting. Love it. The 14 cases in the publication by Church et al. 1988 give a good indication of the range of environmental issues that speak to the needs and priorities of communities, alongside those linked to the built environment. Residents. Data on the people who live in an area are naturally among the most essential for a worker to collect. They are needed not only to understand the nature of the community in which the person is to work, but also because some of this data, such as occupation and country of birth, may indicate sites of disadvantage. Data about residents may usefully be classified as follows. Basic information, this is a subheading. This is data about the demographic, housing, employment, and general well-being of people in the area. It includes the following information: population size and mobility, age and sex of population, country of birth, car ownership, number, size, and types of households, socioeconomic groups in the population, marital status, educational qualifications. These are all colonial and industrial concerns. I just want to point this out. We're only talking about the industrial world in these examples. Housing, overcrowding, tenure, households with and without basic amenities like a bath, water closet, and hot water supply, the number of dwellings that are occupied, shared, and vacant. Employment, number of employed and unemployed by age and sex, types of jobs held by residents, numbers of men and women in part-time work, number of people traveling into and out of the area for work, and hours of work of people, especially those with children under 5 years old. These data on population, housing, and employment are obtainable from the census. So available data is obtainable from the census. But if you are living in an area where citizenship is a threat and deportation is a threat, and legal ability to be in a place is a threat, such as AWOL status of military, then you're not going to have to. Those are populations. How are they invisible from census data? I want to know that for your community. These data on population of census. One advantage of the census to the neighborhood worker is that it provides basic data on residents for each size of an area in which the worker may be interested. For example, regional, borough, town, and rural areas, as well as districts, wards, and parishes. It must be remembered, however, that census data can often be out of date, particularly in areas undergoing major changes. So if you are looking at constitutional monarchies like the United Kingdom or Canada, have different ways of organizing, reporting, and managing data, including as part of their National Health Service, services per 100,000 people and how those are spaced out. So if you're looking at how to organize a community and how to enact policies that are equitable per acre per person, then the UK does have better methods on this. And so often in neighborhood work, we're looking at neighborhood with a U in the middle of it. Additional sources of data on population, housing, and employment may also be available in some authorities. For example, some of this data may be culled from the records of a housing department, or an authority may have carried out its own survey of housing conditions in an area. Again, in the context of the United States and our colonial mindset, housing departments are like project-based housing departments like Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, right? That's not what they're talking to. They're talking about large-scale managed housing information, which NeoCando is a great resource, and we're going to be looking at the other ones I've earmarked as well. Social welfare data. There is a potentially large amount of data that the neighborhood worker can use to make an assessment of the general welfare of a community. Such data include free school meals, school non-attendance and exclusions, juvenile first offenders, infant mortality, electricity and gas meter disconnections, social services caseloads and referrals, homelessness, income support. There are a number of difficulties in using such data. Much of this information is actually about the provisions of services in a community and should not be taken on its own to indicate need. Second, Second, the ease of access of this data will vary. Information on, for example, income support is often particularly difficult to acquire. Also, children's services referral, because what is reported varies wildly based on community supports. Whether your mother is going to call protective services on you is largely dependent upon your relationship with your mother and your mother's relationship with intergenerational supports. Perceptions of the area. The neighborhood worker will want to know residents' perceptions of the boundaries of the area and what they see to be its good and bad characteristics as a place in which to live and work. In particular, the worker will want information on what residents perceive as the problems, issues, and resources in the area, and their ideas about the causes of such problems. There will also be interest in residents' attitudes to the various sections and groups that make up the community and towards service agencies and people like local counselors. Community networks. Residents will be part of, or perhaps not part of, a network of relationships and contacts within their area. The network will comprise relationships with family, neighbors, and friends. The worker needs to understand the extent and functions of these networks, not least because they will be an important part of the support and strength in a community. Community networks are also of interest to the worker because they will have an influence on his or her work in helping residents organize a group. Such factors as the dissemination of news and gossip about an issue, the recruitment of group members, and the extent to which the worker is perceived as an outsider will each be partly determined by the nature of community relationships. Values and traditions. Adequate knowledge about values and traditions is something the worker can hope to acquire only after working in the area for a period. Yet he or she has to acquire some understanding of the diversity or nuances of community norms in the early stages of work, not least because decisions must be guided in the light of what are understood to be important values in the community. At the very least, the worker will want to avoid doing things that offend or flout conventions and values in the area. Alinsky, 1971, has cautioned that workers respect a neighborhood's norms about dress, language, and lifestyle. The community worker who knowingly acts outside the standards for what is proper behavior in the neighborhood risks alienating people. My husband and his wife were on their honeymoon and were walking down the street in another country holding hands, and a woman they did not know came up between them and smacked their hands because that's not what is done there. So alienating, yes. One of the important tasks when a worker leaves a neighborhood is to acquaint his or her successor with people's expectations about behavior. For example, a community worker coming into an ongoing project described to us how, and this is a little longer quotation, "It has already become clear to me that there are significant divisions between various estates in the neighborhood, and that Dunstable Court is looked down upon by the rest of the blocks, even by the people in the tenements. George, the outgoing worker, warned me about the problems of using the Bull and Plow pub. He said that although it is used by the Black Mills Tenants Association, many of the people think it is not a very respectable place to be in." The kind of information the worker will be looking for in this phase of work will largely be concerned with norms that govern social interaction and participation in the area, particularly the neighborhood. For example, a worker was disappointed when few tenants turned up to a meeting in a tenant's flat. He later found out that people in the block were very circumspect about visiting each other's flats, and it was not considered to be the done thing. Second, the worker who wrote to Dunstable Court above tried to organize a meeting of local groups to discuss a summer play scheme. There was little interest in the meeting, largely because he had underestimated the strength of a feeling against Dunstable Court. The other residents did not want to mix with them at a meeting. Norms that determine people's attitudes to organizing as a group and taking action to achieve some change. Particularly important are norms that influence the taking up and exercise of leadership and authority. Of particular interest may be the attitudes of men to the involvement of women in neighborhood work. See Rotary International. For example, neighborhood workers continue to witness instances in coalfield communities of male paternalism of women and skepticism about their involvement. See current LA fire crisis as of January 2025. Organizations. The first difficulty that we encounter in gathering information about organizations in an area is that there are invariably a great number of them with a diversity of goals, roles, and operating procedures. The neighborhood worker must first decide on some way of conceptualizing this organizational environment so as to provide a guide for the arrangement and classification of data. One way of presenting this material is to simply make a list of organizations, using a mixture of type and function to decide upon the headings for this list. This method is illustrated below in describing the range of organizations that the worker will seek information about. Local and central government. This includes departments concerned with education, health, planning, regeneration, social services, probation, housing, and social security. Information will be needed on each aspect of a department's work. Education, for example, will need to be looked at in terms of schools, higher, adult, and community learning, and youth provision. For each organization or department, the worker will seek to know the nature and extent of its services, its structures, goals, policies, funding, and the staffing arrangement. So easy. Its impact upon and intentions for the community, the nature of its relationships and communications with the community and with other organizations, what resources it has that may be of use to community groups. Economic activities. The worker will need to know about the production and distribution of goods and services in the community. He or she will want to know not only where people work, but also the range and importance of industrial, commercial, trade, and occupational activities in the area. A worker may try to assess the area's economic base according to whether it is, for instance, manufacturing, industrial, commercial, or recreational. He or she may need to construct a history and profile of major employers in the area. Information about transport facilities and retail and wholesale services like shops, pubs, cafes, and so on is also useful. Other information needed would include that on land usage and zoning and how vulnerable the area is to redevelopment, the balance between private and public industries, the character of the private rented housing stock, and the renting and management policies of its workers. The worker may want to make an assessment of the long-term security and stability of the area's economy, taking into account factors such as the narrowness or breadth of its economic base, the relationship between the economic structure and social conditions and nature of the community. Now, if I'm looking for all of these things from organizations on local, central government, and economic activities, faith organizations, the community sector, and the voluntary sector, I can get all of this. I know community block grants and community development centers, CDCs. CDCs know this data, and there are people in your neighborhood. In the city of Cleveland, we have CDCs all over the place, but most regions in Ohio will have a community development center for their region who's responsible for this kind of data. Shout out Bel Air Puritas Development Corporation. Faith organizations. The worker will examine these organizations to determine both what they contribute to the life of the area and the nature of any resources, such as a meeting place, that they may have that would be useful to community groups. The presence and role of such organizations is often a crucial factor in trying to work with a wide range of groups and organizations in the community. So many faith organizations are really excited to have people showing up during non-service time, non-sanctuary times. Community sector. Most areas have a number of associations or groups pursuing a variety of goals with membership open to the public or certain sections of it. The minimum data that the worker will require about associations are the names and addresses of officers and any paid staff, time and place of meetings, aims, functions, and activities, numbers of members and their characteristics in terms of age, sex, class, income, and residence, and an association's resources and facilities. So associations or groups would be, to me, the first two I think of are Kiwanis and Rotary. There are many more. VFWs, I think, would be a community sector. Voluntary sector. The worker will require similar information about voluntary organizations in the area, such as councils for voluntary service, community councils, race equality councils, and organizations serving particular groups, such as young people. These organizations are of particular importance to the worker because they are a source of information about the area. Be looking up City Year, be looking up Jesuit Volunteer Corps, AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps, Jesuits. These are all places that can have volunteer organizations in the area. The voluntary sector, Catholic churches around the world, St. Vincent de Paul covers the globe. Whether you are Catholic or not, there are volunteers from St. Vincent de Paul who carry out corporal works of mercy, like visiting the imprisoned, burying the dead. All of these things are available voluntary services anywhere. Communications. It is central to the neighborhood worker's task to understand how ideas, information, and news are disseminated within the area. The worker wants to know, too, the most effective ways of communicating with key people in the area, whether residents or those in service agencies. It is useful to know which instruments and channels of communication carry weight amongst particular sections of the community and help to shape and change public opinion. The means of communication in an area will range from informal verbal contacts on the one hand to ICT and newspapers on the other. The neighborhood worker will need to study fly posting, leaflets, tenants' newsletters, the websites of service organizations, television, and radio. As far as newspapers are concerned, the worker may find a range of projects, including those of action groups, the alternative press, and large circulation local newspapers. Such an analysis of the media, together with contacts with individual reporters and feature writers, will help to indicate which newspapers will report systematically or sympathetically the activities of a community group. Are you familiar with the Vine, the Street Outreach, NEOC? I know that there are smaller local papers that go out, but I'm not aware of a lot of large community papers that go out. Power and leadership. By the time the neighborhood worker has gathered information on the residents, organizations, and communications of an area, she or he will have already amassed a good deal of knowledge about how power, leadership, and influence are exercised within the community. Therefore, most of the work in this aspect of data collection involves abstracting and synthesizing material already gathered. We suggest that data about an area's power structure may be classified as as follows. Business and organized labor. The decisions and ambitions of the private sector and trade unions have a potent influence on the general growth and development of an area. The worker needs to understand how these two interests influence decision-making in the community, particularly that of local authority counselors and officers. So this would be probably city and county government. Business and industry may exercise power directly or indirectly through organizations like a chamber of commerce or meetings of business and professional people such as the Rotary Club and Roundtable. Elective politics. Here the worker will study the role and influence of political parties in the area. She or he will be interested in the strength of ward membership and the percentage of people turning out to vote at local, national, and European elections. The worker will study the power and influence of particular ward councilors and members of the local parliament and assess their contributions to policymaking at the town hall. Do you know your state of Ohio senators? She or he must understand the power of the party caucus, the basis and extent of cabinet government, and the power and influence of committee chairpersons in the local authority. Of particular interest will be the degree of involvement, if any, of the traditional local political parties in working with local people on community issues. Community groups often develop to fill a vacuum created by councilors and ward parties. Groups can also be seen as unhelpful by councilors, especially in areas where one political party is dominant. The idea of a participatory democracy complementing the representative system is not in reality accepted everywhere. Administrative politics. This phrase describes the situation where counselors have given most or all of their responsibilities for decisions to the paid officer of the council. This is in complete contradiction to the Block article on citizenship. We use the phrase administrative politics also to refer to the general involvement of professional staff in organizational policy decisions. Such involvement may be accorded to staff on the basis of their professional expertise or because staff are given autonomy in the running of some aspects of a department's activities. It is important for the worker in groups to understand the interplay between the economic, elected, and administrative personnel in the area and their respective contributions to decision-making. In addition, the worker must identify those in an organization who understand the nature of her or his work and would be sympathetic to the work of community groups. They may eventually provide important support and feed information to the group. Many community groups fighting planning and redevelopment proposals, for instance, have been helped unofficially by basic grade staff in planning departments. Civic politics. This term is used to embrace a great variety of organizations and interests who hold power and influence power in a community. It includes professional, cultural, and faith organizations, the media, voluntary agencies and societies, community and neighborhood councils, advisory and management committees attached to social services and housing departments, planning forums and partnerships, and historical and conservationist societies. If you're in the Northeast Ohio region, the Western Reserve, this area was the Western Reserve of Connecticut for a very long time. And so the Western Reserve has great historical and civic data. Community politics. This includes groups which consist largely of residents in the community. The groups may be organized on a geographic or interest group basis. Examples are tenants association, residents committees, play associations, and a range of groups formed to take action on some community issue or problem. Community politics also refers to meetings of groups in an area such as minority ethnic groups, lodges, secret societies, and cliques. We also include here the exercise of power and influence by individuals resident in an area who exercise their influence through an informal network of kin and social relations. We must stress a number of aspects of this categorization of power and influence. First, the worker must be alert to the fact that alongside the formal and public power structure, there's usually a host of people attempting to influence decisions and events. I'm clutching my pearls. These influentials may range from the open campaigning of a newspaper or pressure group to the covert lobbying of decision makers by interested parties. Second, formal power holders exercise that power not only in ceremonies like committee meetings, but also in informal ways and on informal occasions. For example, Camp David with the presidency. Third, there is a good deal of interplay and overlap between the categories of power we have described. Many individuals will be involved in business and elective and civic politics. Finally, it would be a mistake to see power structures like a local authority as uniform and coherent systems. Any organization may be seen to comprise individuals and groups in cooperation and conflict with each other about matters like organizational goals, policies, and resources. As such, they reveal substantial tensions and rivalries that are there to be exploited by a discerning and skillful community group. It is part of the task of the neighborhood worker to come to know these organizational weaknesses and also to know what kinds of pressures and publicity they may be vulnerable. How do I go about data collection? We have indicated there is a daunting array of data that are germane to the neighborhood worker in the initial phases of intervention. Not only must time and energy be given to choosing and gathering this data, but the worker will also be involved at this stage in other activities, such as settling into the agency and making contacts with people in the community and other agencies. The multiple demands on the worker's time in this phase make it necessary that she or he comes to the task of data collection with a strategy about what data are needed and how they will be collected. There is little point in workers rushing around gathering facts, figures, and opinions in one hectic scramble. There are 3 useful questions to ask of data. Do I need them? What do I need them for? Do I need them now? There is the danger that without planning, the worker will collect so many data they overwhelm his or her physical and intellectual capacity to process them. The best way to collect data is to gather them for the particular purposes at hand, rather than collecting them to store like a squirrel for some imagined day in the future when they might turn out to be useful. I feel very called out about all the articles I've been saving. However, am I not using it? So what if it's been in a box for 9 years? We have found it helpful to consider 4 aspects in thinking about how to collect data. They are deciding which neighborhood to work in, taking a first look at the chosen neighborhood, the broad angle scan, some key principles in collecting data, analysis, interpretation, and write-up. Deciding which neighborhood to work in. In this phase, the worker only needs data that will help decide in which neighborhood he or she will work. The worker will collect comparative data and will begin to decide on the boundaries of an area in which to work. A project, for instance, coming into a local authority will set about comparing different areas in the authority in order to choose into which area it should move. It will then need more data to decide upon a specific neighborhood within that larger area. In order to make this decision, the worker has to identify areas that are variously described as being in need, deprived, or disadvantaged. The worker does not assume that everybody in such an area is in need, but that such areas are likely to contain problems and issues which community work could address. Thus, the worker needs only those data which indicate likely areas of social exclusion. The most useful source for such social indicators is the census. And our suggestion is that in this phase, the worker need collect only census data that indicate a real concentration of residents who are disadvantaged in the housing, employment, and education markets. Such census data would include information on the proportion of privately rented furnished accommodation, the extent of multi-occupation and overcrowding, the existence or lack of basic housing amenities. Think Monroe County, Ohio, and what the housing is like there compared to Franklin County, Ohio. Of course, if other social indicators such as data on free school meals are available, then the worker should also make use of them. For example, if you are above a certain threshold of people who qualify for free school meals, every person in that school has free school meals versus areas where they don't meet the threshold and then only certain kids receive free school meals in America, in Ohio. It must be emphasized that the choice of data from the census will be influenced by the worker's values and mandate. If his or her job is to work with particular groups in the population, such as young or older people, then the worker would obviously use the census to search for areas where such groups are to be found. Having collected census data on the different areas that are competing for his or her resources, the neighborhood worker must then rank them on each of those variables that have been taken from the census and decide which area to work in. The ranking of the areas may indicate which is in greatest need, though often the census figures may only distinguish very different areas. For example, middle class, mainly owner-occupied districts from predominantly council or housing association-owned estates. Again, this is the UK. So what are we missing here is migrant workers who move seasonally from place to place. Where are they included at the time of census? Indicators from the census will often be of limited value and will be only one of a number of factors to be considered. They will be weighted against convenience, political expediency, and notions of balance and fairness. For example, a worker may decide not to work in a neighborhood that is indicated as an area of need if, for example, there are already community work resources to be found in it. The worker's choice between these areas will also presumably be influenced by impressions formed when walking about the area, by the views and priorities expressed by his or her agency, and by the worker's assessment of the potential for achieving change that exists in different neighborhoods. Taking a first look on the chosen neighborhood, the broad angle scan. The worker may now be ready to study the neighborhood through what Etzioni 1967 calls a broad angle scan. The purpose of this scan is to determine the principal features of the neighborhood and to direct the worker to those aspects of neighborhood life and issues that he or she wishes to study in more detail. It is clearly not desirable or feasible for the worker to examine exhaustively every aspect of neighborhood life. The worker is forced at this early stage of the work to be selective in the data collected. He or she may, of course, be selective by the randomly or haphazardly choosing features of the neighborhood to study, but we suggest that a broad angle scan provides more reliable and perhaps rational form of guidance as to which aspects of the community should be researched in depth. The broad angle scan will throw up a series of issues. For example, housing, play, unemployment, traffic, loneliness, neighborhood care. Groups, for example, claimants, disabled, homeless, and older people. Territories, for example, particular housing estates or streets. Agencies, organizations, and policies, or existing community groups that the worker that can then decide to investigate further. In addition, the broad angle scan will give to the worker the feel of the neighborhood and an overview of its characteristics. both of which are essential for the collection and analysis of data about specific parts or aspects of the neighborhood. Before we continue, we offer some words of caution and support that should be borne in mind when reading the rest of this chapter. The emphasis and detail of our discussion of data collection may lead workers and students to spend too much time on it, or even to give up, feeling that they are not adequately prepared for the job. We have tried to be thorough and detailed in our presentation in order to provide a guide as to what might be done. It is not our intention to suggest that every worker should collect every kind of data to which we refer. With these words of qualification, we suggest that the broad angle scan should comprise the following activities. Analyzing the census. The worker should use the census to acquire basic information about residents of the area. As discussed earlier, this includes information on age and sex, place of birth, housing tenure and conditions, socioeconomic groupings, types of employment, and unemployment. This will often be a reanalysis of census data collected in Phase 1. Street work. The worker walks the streets and visits the amenities such as cafes, pubs, shops, etc. of the neighborhood in order to observe and talk with people. He or she must deliberately seek contact with different sections of the population and begin to understand which people frequent which parts of the neighborhood, at what times, and for what purposes. Where do the office workers get lunch in your neighborhood? Do they walk there? Do they drive there? Do they drive further away to be able to go through a drive-through? Through talking with people, the worker sees indications and clues as to how people see the neighborhood and what they perceive as its strengths and weaknesses, issues and problems. The worker also wants to know how the people themselves divide up the area into constituent patches. Which streets go with which streets to form mini communities within the neighborhood. Scanning newspapers. Find out what newspapers and magazines are read in the neighborhood and read through a selection of back issues. Another reading task at this stage is to obtain a preliminary grasp of the development of the area by going to the local library and seeing if they have a guide to or history of the neighborhood. And clearly, in a very normal way, this is my favorite vacation activity, is to read a local newspaper. It's so illuminating and makes me fall in love with the place. Using the worker's own agency records, the worker should acquaint themselves thoroughly with the records and papers of their predecessor, if any, and also scrutinize agency papers and proposals that led up to the appointment that perhaps indicate needs and issues in the neighborhood. Any data of their own agency on the area should be examined. Some agencies may have produced community profiles before the advent of the worker, though it is often the case that workers are disappointed by the lack of depth in agency views of neighborhood issues. Finally, the worker should talk with agency colleagues and understand their perceptions of the neighborhood. If you don't already know the development person for your organization or the person responsible for development tasks, it's a great source of data that is included in any kind of grant writing. Getting to know other agencies. This includes understanding the structures and major provisions of the local authority. The worker may acquire or assemble a directory of the names and addresses of the local councilors, leading politicians, chairpersons, and members of the authority's committees, and of its principal professional staff. He or she should also study the agenda and minutes from the council for, say, the past year, looking for items about the neighborhood, and seek out reports on the neighborhood that may have been prepared by council departments. A similar understanding of health agencies should also be undertaken. Getting to know community groups. The worker should also get together the names and addresses of officers of any existing community groups and try to acquire the newsletters and minutes of these groups and begin to understand a little of their origins and functions. Finding out who serves the neighborhood. Here, the worker wants some initial information on the range of organizations and agencies that are based in or serve the neighborhood. At this stage, this kind of information may be best acquired from colleagues in the worker's agency. Before beginning these various activities that constitute the broad angle scan, the worker had best think about how much time and energy they will be given. When he or she has assembled and studied this information, the worker should be ready to move into the next phase, which is that of a more detailed and methodical study. However, it may often be the case that the worker feels he has collected sufficient data through the broad angle scan to move into the action stage of work, or the contacts the worker has made have resulted in specific requests for assistance that he feels cannot be refused or postponed. In either of these cases, the worker may decide to proceed no further with data collection. If this decision is made, the worker has to be as certain as possible that he is not moving too soon or on the wrong issues or with the wrong people. If, for example, the worker decides on the basis of impressionistic conversations with people that play is an issue in the area, he ought to be sure that play is indeed a concern in the minds of residents and not just a bee in the bonnet of those few people talked to. One way of finding out is to run with an issue and see what happens. Another way, and one which helps to diminish the possibility of an early failure marring the worker's attempt to organize within the neighborhood, is to hold off from action for a little while longer and plan and carry out a more detailed collection of data. Can you see how time-consuming this process is? And this process is not living where I live, right? I just had a session where a person was talking about the place where they grew up swimming. And this is a common story in America. I remember this rec center. I remember living there. I remember just how amazing it was. And it was such a big part of my life. And I'm so grateful for it. And someone else said, must have been nice. We weren't allowed, right? And this person who was not born in, this person was born after the civil rights movement and grew up after the civil rights movement. And so segregation was illegal. And yet people were not allowed to join that recreation center. Tiger Woods was playing Augusta, and they had to change the rule of that country club in the 1990s. They still were saying they would not admit members of color. So these things that are invisible to people who live in the neighborhood cannot be taken for granted. And of course, how would you know? You are just thinking about playing golf and I can't believe I got in. You're thinking about swimming and you're just so happy about it because you're a child. But that is living in a neighborhood. That is not organizing, collecting data about who is or is not included in this broad angle scan. Some key principles in collecting data. Data collection should be comprehensive and detailed and thorough and systematic in its methods. The worker wants to gather valid and reliable data rather than impressions which contribute to his or her conversations, his or her decisions about interventions. The worker undertakes these activities by using methods and principles that reduce as far as possible the influence of chance, bias, and subjectivity on his or her findings. That is, the worker attempts to provide valid and reliable data by A, using methods of investigation that are commonly associated with social research, such as the survey, and B, using those methods with due attention to and understanding of the principles that inform their use in the field of social research. For example, a worker who carries out a survey must do so with some regard to the principles of survey design and administration. What makes a good question? What makes a bad question? There is also little value in carrying out a survey if insufficient attention has been given to matters like sampling. The purpose of this section is only to review some of the important methods through which workers may obtain valid and reliable data. Readers must turn to specialized textbook for further advice on the techniques and principles involved. Questioning. We want to consider two methods of questioning that seem most common and or useful to neighborhood workers. They are questionnaire and focused interviews. Questionnaires. A questionnaire may be administered by post, by telephone, by asking informants to complete it themselves and calling back to collect it, and by a face-to-face interview. Each way of administering the questionnaire, however, has its own advantages and disadvantages relating to, for example, cost and refusal rate, and the worker must assess which method is appropriate to the task at hand. On balance, the personal interview, in which the worker asks the questions and records the person's responses, is probably the most appropriate for neighborhood work, not least because it brings the worker into contact with people who might be later involved in the formation of a group. Another task for workers is to decide what type of questionnaire will be used. Questionnaires vary from being very standardized on the one hand to completely unstructured on the other. We shall discuss the unstructured kind later in looking at the focused interview. In the standardized questionnaire, the interviewers ask the same questions in the same order to everyone who has been selected for the interview. The nature of the stimulus to the respondents, the verbal question, is kept as unvarying as possible. Samsagrants, this is the GIPRA. In capitals, you read it exactly as it is. If it's in varying case, you may restate after reading exactly the way it is. You may restate if there's clarification, right? There are two kinds of questions on these questionnaires: the closed or fixed alternative question, in which the respondents are asked to choose between alternative replies, and open question, to which the respondent may reply as he or she wishes, and the interview must try to record the response in full. The following are among the major issues that the worker must consider if he or she decides to become involved in the surveys or self-surveys that use a questionnaire. Detailed advice on these aspects of questionnaires should be sought from a research methods textbook. The design of the questionnaire. Thought must be given to the objectives of the survey and the intentions of the worker, the issues or matters that the questionnaire must cover, the form of the questionnaire, how standardized it is to be, and the balance between open and closed questions, its length, and the order of questions, and question wording. The worker must also decide how he or she will approach respondents, particularly how he or she will explain the purposes and sponsorship of the investigation. Piloting the questionnaire. It is essential to pilot the proposed questionnaire in order to test it for length, relevance, wording, and sequence of questions, and its overall impact on respondents. Choosing a sample. Whether or not a sample has to be chosen depends on the size of the group or population in which the worker is interested, and the time, money, and help available. The advantage that sampling has over haphazardly picked out individuals for interviewing is that it allows one to make inferences from the sample about the population from which it has been chosen. So a sample, which is random, is more representative of the whole than just randomly and intuitively coming across people in the world. The three kinds of sampling methods likely to be of most use to neighborhood workers are the simple random sample, the systematic sample, and the quota sample. In the simple random sample, each member of the population has an equal and known chance of being selected. The selection is made by assigning a number to each unit of the population from which the sample is to be drawn. Identification of the units that will make up the sample is achieved by a number of techniques, including drawing numbered discs from a bag, the use of random number tables, or a computer. Systematic sampling involves drawing every nth unit, a person or household, for example, from a list of those units, taking every 10th name from an electoral register, or every 5th name from a list of community groups in an area, or taking every 3rd case from a list of an agency's clients are examples of sampling systematically. Systematic sampling is not strictly random because the people on a list do not have an equal chance of inclusion. The people that fall between the nth person have no chance of inclusion. In quota sampling, the interviews are given quotas of people to interview. They are asked to interview so many people according to, for example, different age, sex, class, and housing tenure groups. The number of interviews that are to be with men and women or with different ages is calculated from available data like the census. For example, if 60% of the residents in a street are female, then the worker would ensure that 60% of the people interviewed were female. The relative strengths and weaknesses of these three and other methods of sampling are discussed in textbooks. Interviewing also poses particular problems for the neighborhood worker and for members of a community group carrying out a self-survey. On the one hand, they will be interested in building up rapport with residents. On the other, they must guard against their interests, opinions, and values about neighborhood issues, influencing, distorting the replies that respondents offer. These cautionary words about some aspects of the use of questionnaires serve to indicate that to do a survey or self-survey will require a good deal of study, time, and skill. Before embarking on a survey, it is best to make sure that the information that is required is not already available or cannot be acquired through means other than a questionnaire. The self-survey must be seen to be a more attractive proposition to the worker because it makes use of available resources in the community. But the participation of residents and/or colleagues does not necessarily represent a simple gain in numbers of people and hours. The worker will find that time has to be allocated to the recruitment and encouragement of helpers, work with them to discuss the purposes of the data collection and the design and planning of the methods to be used, training them in the use of the methods if these are unfamiliar, supervising their work and being able to for support and discussion when helpers find problems when their enthusiasm wanes, and the collective analysis, interpretation, and presentation of data that have been assembled. And the self-survey that we're talking about is exactly the Blue Point evaluations you collect on your instructors. I think I receive 4 or 5 emails every semester reminding me that they're coming out, reminding me to remind you, reminding me to tell you that they're anonymous or whatever. Then all of those are collected, compiled, and anonymized, and the data is put together, and I have a collective score of, how I rank on 1 to 5 on average. So the self-survey, you guys are not going to do them, right? Unless you're very motivated positively, very motivated negatively, or they used to just make us do them and fill them out in person when the teacher was out of the room, and you had to do them like towards the end to do your final, to start your final. So I'm sure that they're incentivizing you like, I don't even know how. But who completes surveys is people who like completing surveys. So it's not random when you just mail out pen and paper samples. Additionally, there may be disadvantages to using local people or agency colleagues. Residents may be reluctant to answer questions posed by neighbors. Another argument against self-surveys is that the group which undertakes the work may too easily become the nucleus for a task or issue group that may emerge from the work carried out on the survey. People may come to expect the self-surveyors to take on the problems, and the self-surveyors may not be able or want to handle the expectations that generates. The self-survey has, however, advantages because of the fact that it involves local people. Self-surveys are more oriented to taking action on a particular issue and are often used to prepare people for collective action by getting them involved in the collection and analysis of information. For a discussion of the pros and cons of self-surveys and for advice on carrying them out, the reader is referred to the appendix. For an example of a community audit toolkit used based on a survey carried out by a group of local people in the Hare Hills and Chapeltown areas of Leeds, see Tiagi 2001, which I am marking. And also, this makes me think about peer workers. We want peer workers. We don't know what we want peer workers to do, but imagine if all client survey information for a mental health agency was carried out by peer support professionals. That would be a local people self-survey, would it not? More so than your case manager telling you, I'm sorry, I need you to do this again. Here's your ComT or whatever. Focused interviews. These may be seen as less standardized and structured form of a personal interviewing using a questionnaire. The interviewer has a checklist of questions or issues to raise with the respondent, who is allowed to answer them freely. Likewise, the interviewer is free to probe the respondent's replies as seems appropriate, and to add to and modify the interview as it proceeds if the respondent raises relevant but unanticipated issues. Such interviews are also focused by virtue of the fact that they are planned. The interviewer, in this case the neighborhood worker, must think about how she will present herself and her objectives, and prepare strategies that specifies what information she wants, how to ask for it, and what factors will hinder and facilitate the interviewee's cooperativeness. There seem to be three primary uses to which the focused interview can be put in data collection. First, it helps the worker to understand more thoroughly how local residents perceive and describe the area in which they live. It permits the worker to acquire some understanding of how residents name the world. Second, it provides the main tool for acquiring detailed information about agencies and organizations operating in the neighborhood. Third, the focused interview is useful in acquiring more information about the particularly complex aspects of community life. For example, it may be used to build up information about power, leadership, and influence in a community. Additionally, the worker can interview a range of people in order to understand the different perceptions of an issue in a neighborhood, such as homelessness, unemployment, or loneliness. Before completing this section on questioning, it is worth referring briefly to a range of methods of data collection that are generally referred to as indirect. They include the following. Sentence completion. If there is one change I could bring about in this neighborhood, it would be. The projective question. Suppose a person from Mars came down to this neighborhood and you were the first person she saw, and she asked you what kind of neighborhood this was. What would you tell her? Another form of the projective question involves asking the respondent about views of other people. For example, some people who live in this estate find a lot of faults with it. I wonder if you can guess what they are referring to. Adjective checklist. Respondents are shown a list of varied adjectives that purport to describe the neighborhood. The respondents are asked to say which they think apply. I want to do all of these so far. Inventories. There are two kinds which seem potentially useful in community work. With the first, respondents are shown a list of problems, needs, and asked to indicate the problems that most affect them as residents in the neighborhood. The second kind of inventory contains a list of general statements. For example, shopping facilities for older people in this area are poor. And respondents are asked to say whether they are true or false. Indirect methods, such as these, originated in clinical and social psychology, which we'll forgive them for, but they are now used in community settings, not least by market researchers. We believe they offer a useful alternative to questionnaires for the neighborhood worker engaged in data collection. That's so funny that they said it's from psychology, because I was looking at those and I was like, I know forms of therapy that use that. I know which form of therapy uses that on all of them. All right, observation. By this phase of intervention, observing what goes on in the neighborhood will have become second nature to most workers. But observation can be undertaken in a more systematic fashion, paying more regard to certain principles and care in the collection, recording, and analysis of the data obtained. In order for it to result in useful, reliable data, it is important that the neighborhood worker spends time on these organizational aspects. One of the first decisions for the worker wishing to organize a more systematic form of observation is the degree of participation. At one extreme, the worker can be a complete observer with very little interaction with the observed, who may not know that what the worker is or what her job in the community is. At the other extreme, the worker will be so keen on building up relationships with local residents that she maximizes participation and attempts to share as many experiences of the observed as possible. The stance may endanger objectivity. As with personal interviews, the worker must strike a balance between satisfying her requirements as a community worker and satisfying those as an investigator and collector of information. If one thing is clear, however, the worker will seldom want to be a totally passive observer. It will be found that the degree of participation with those being observed will vary with factors like the time the worker has been in the neighborhood and the social setting in which observations are taking place. A more active role is also made likely by the fact that participant observation consists not only of observations, but also of questions of and interviews with those being observed. The participant observer's use of questioning is, of course, in accord with the values and principles of questions within community work practice. The use of the question is an important element in practice, as described by writers such as Saul Alinsky and T.R. Benton. There are two types of questioning that seem to be part of the participant observer's techniques for gaining data. They have been described by Strauss et al. 1964 as the reportorial type of question, in which respondents are asked informally about the who, what, where, how, and why of events, and the posing types of questions. Strauss distinguishes between the following types of posing questions. The challenge or devil's advocate question. The field worker deliberately confronts the respondents with arguments of the opponents. Devil's advocate does not mean I'm just going to disagree with what you're saying, right? These are the specific arguments of people who oppose your current idea. This is like a key part of debate. It's not just disagreeing with people for fun. The idea is to elicit rhetorical assertion and thus to round out the respondent's position by forcing him to respond to challenge. The hypothetical question. This kind of question is another technique for rounding out the respondent's thought structure, but without accompanying rhetorical heat. The field worker poses a number of possible occurrences. For example, what would happen if you stopped paying rent? An extended example of both types of posing question is provided by Alinsky, 1971. Posing the ideal. There are two variations on this technique. First, the respondent can be asked to describe the ideal situation. Secondly, while the field worker can still pretend to be somewhat naive, he can assert an ideal to see what response is elicited. Happily, what usually happens is that when the investigator poses an ideal, respondents not only counter with other ideals, but in the process tend to point out the shortcomings of reality. So this is like the magic question. If I could wave a wand and your community looked exactly how it looked, how would it look? Right? And they would be like, well, it looked like this, but here's the problem with it. That's challenging or shortcomings of reality and coming to terms with, well, maybe it can't look exactly the way I would like it to look. I should talk to the olds who live in my apartment building. They have ideas about the ideal. Offering interpretations or testing propositions on respondents. It is sometimes very useful to tell respondents about the propositions that one is beginning to pull together about events interesting to them. If they disagree, they will usually volunteer information to counter a proposition, which may lead the field worker into further unanticipated search. If they agree, the tendency is to qualify the proposition. It does not quite meet the case. Again, the field worker comes away with additional valuable information. As with other forms of collection, attention has to be paid in participant observation to the design of fieldwork, sampling, entering the fieldwork situation, record keeping, and the interpretation and analysis of data. Recording observations is particularly difficult in participant observation, and most observers have to rely on a combination of memory, symbols, and discreetly written notes. Using written materials. We have already stressed that the census is likely to prove the most valuable written source of data, and we have already indicated what data should be extracted from the census in the broad angle scan. In this section, we wish to deal briefly with 3 other types of written material. Local newspapers. I'm hoping to have a newspaper person on here. I'm almost certain that it's going to happen. And he's got such a great story about the newspaper, when it went down, and what the publication and distribution is like now as this person is trying to get it going again. Local newspapers. A worker in a neighborhood may want to undertake a more systematic analysis of the content of local newspapers in order to add knowledge of felt and expressed needs. The special technique for analyzing the content of the media is called content analysis. The first task is to decide which local newspapers to study. It is fortunate that most neighborhoods are served by only one, at the most 2 large circulation local newspapers. This is from 2002. So Facebook did not become publicly available until 2008. So this is a different journalistic time. So the worker may decide to study all the local papers read in the neighborhood. These papers are also likely to be weeklies. The worker may also decide to study the content of newsletters and community newspaper put out by community groups. It is unlikely that the time will be available to study all the issues of local publications, so the worker must prepare a time sample. He or she might, for instance, decide to study all the issues of the local weekly newspaper that have appeared in the last 6 months. That is about 26. How many issues to read and analyze will be partly determined by how much time is available, and the worker can clearly choose a larger sample if help is available from local people or colleagues. The next step is to determine which parts of the newspaper will be studied: headlines, editorials, features, news, photographs, and so on. Alternatively, the worker may decide to analyze the content of the whole newspaper. The most basic aspect of content analysis is to note the frequency with which certain items appear in newspapers. So the worker must decide what kinds of items are to be counted. For instance, he or she may prepare a list of categories of need or issues in the neighborhood, such as play, housing, transport, shopping facilities, and so on. The worker will need to be clear what the rules are for classifying an item within one of these categories. He or she then proceeds methodically to classify newspaper items within these categories, noting the number of appearances of articles, features, editorials, letters, and so on concerned with one of the categories. When this has been done, the worker is in a position to count up the items found in the categories, and this will give a simple quantitative indication of which issue seems most important, as measured by the frequency of its appearance. I cannot tell you how excited people get if you have an Excel spreadsheet and you have real data to show them. Counting the number of items an issue appears is, of course, a superficial form of content analysis. A worker who wants to improve on this can use refinements like considering the amount of space that is given to various neighborhood issues by measuring column inches. The findings of a content analysis, such as the one described, are not unambiguous. The frequency with which issues are mentioned may just as well reflect the editorial policy or interest of the paper as felt and expressed needs in the community. The usefulness of data derived from a content analysis of papers is that they can be added to the worker's store of knowledge about the neighborhood that has been acquired from a range of other sources. Okay, just checking my time here. Local history sources. Having gained some familiarity with the area's history, the worker may now want to extend and deepen this knowledge. The best way to start doing this is to go to the local library. It will contain books, guides, directories, and maps about the neighborhood and its hinterland. It may also possess primary source material like archives and public, family, and business records. Something about hinterland. Like, what is a hinterland? Think about the city of Las Vegas, which exists in the middle of this valley, and everything to the outside ring of mountains, which is an enormous geographical area. Everything is Las Vegas. Not everything is developed, and much of it is hinterland. So if you've ever tried to drive like to the Cowboy Trail, you know it's 45 minutes from everywhere in Vegas to get to anywhere in Vegas. There will almost certainly be a librarian who will not only advise on primary and secondary sources, but may also be a source of information in his or her own right. Some libraries also produce written guides to available local history sources. Another useful place to seek information and advice is a local history society. Most workers will have limited time and interest in understanding the local history. Can't relate. So, presumably, they will need to be selective in what they study. A worker, for instance, might only want to know about the development of a particular trade or industry or geographical patch, and this will provide the boundaries for the inquiries. Some may choose to get an all-round appreciation of the neighborhood's history. In this case, they might confine their study to getting information on the origin and growth of the settlement, changes in population size and structure, housing and living conditions, the economics, occupations, and employment of the neighborhood, and changes in values and traditions, particularly as they relate to socialization processes through institutions like the family, education, and religion. Any worker who believes it is important to study primary sources of information needs to be aware that there are, as in all other aspects of data collection, systematic and thorough ways of proceeding. Agency records. The worker will have examined his or her agency's records and will also have used information from a variety of agencies in compiling the social indicators that were used to help in the decision about which neighborhood to work in. Data from agency records also complements the profiles on agency structures, services, and policies that the worker constructs from focused interviews with agency staff. The neighborhood worker may make a special study of agency records, not just to gain additional information about the agency, but largely to understand more about needs and issues in the neighborhood. Most central and local government agencies gather data about their service users quite routinely. Such data include, for example, social services case record analyses, health and education statistics, crime records, and so forth. Besides records on their services and users, most agencies also produce reports, minutes, brochures, and annual reports. There are difficulties in using agency data. The geographical areas for which local agencies keep data are seldom coterminous, and often they are larger than the area or neighborhood in which the worker is interested. In such cases, the worker may need to seek access to the raw data from which agencies' records have been compiled. For example, I was consulting with someone on a prison release program that was like building families, and it was trying to engage people, primarily fathers from a men's prison, with their children prior to release and rebuild and engage in family therapy with family members who have been caring for the children. And my first question was, just because a person is in prison in a certain area does not mean their family is geographically close. So I want to know all kinds of things about your transportation funding. And they went, oh, yeah. So who is actually being served or who needs to be served is not necessarily in a contiguous region to where you are. Analysis, interpretation, and write-up. It is misleading to present analysis, interpretation, and write-up as terminal activities in the fourth phase of data collection. They are and ought to be ongoing activities to which the neighborhood worker pays attention from the first phase of data collection. Analysis of data must go hand in hand with its collection, if only to guide the worker in decisions about further material required. Each phase of the process of data collection should end with a review of the data so far assembled, so that they may inform what has to be done in succeeding phases. It is also more efficient, interesting, and less error prone to analyze and write up data as one proceeds, rather than leaving oneself with a large amount of information to wade through at the end of the process with collection. Analysis and interpretation of quantitative and qualitative data about a local neighborhood demands of the worker skills and objectivity of a high order. I'm sure that they are all paid accordingly. There are two major aspects of the analysis and interpretation of neighborhood data. First, the data must be scrutinized in relation to their validity, reliability, and relevance. The worker has to decide which data ought to be put aside and which may be safely and honestly used as a basis for decisions about work. The claims of conflicting or contradictory pieces of information have to be evaluated. Second, the data have to be broken up in order to discern the various issues, trends, and relationships that they contain. While the highest possible standard of analysis here have to be brought to bear on the data, it is equally important that the worker does not lose sight of the fact that the collection and analysis of data has been undertaken as an aid to action. They must thus be analyzed and written up in ways that facilitate decisions that the worker must take about future activities. Writing up the data. The extent and nature of the report of the data will be largely determined by what the worker plans to do with the report. Writing up one's analysis and conclusions is only part of the total process, and the worker must decide what his or her objectives are in spending time and energy on writing a report. What the worker intends to do with the report, or the kind of action he or she envisages when taking the report has been produced, should determine the kind of report written. Report writing, like most things, ought to be planned, and one of the key planning questions is, for whom will I be writing this report of my data collection? In other words, who will be the kinds of people to read it? You might expect that the write-up will be read by as diverse an audience as community residents, agency colleagues and managers, elected members and staff in other agencies concerned with the neighborhood. If this is the case, then the worker must consider two further issues in planning a report. Is one report sufficient? Should I not consider writing a number of reports, each one geared to a particular set of readers? The worker might consider the report is suitable, say, for his or her agency, may not be the most appropriate for influencing counselors or for raising awareness among residents about the needs and issues uncovered in the collection of data. So, for example, when I performed the crisis intervention behavioral health services program development, planning, implementation, and I was the service provider and I reported on all the data monthly and quarterly, I had monthly data reports, monthly progress reports with my policy analyst, and the purpose of those reports was to say, here are the people served, here are the outcomes, here are the problems we encountered, here are the lessons learned, who else is learning these things? And my federal policy analyst would then give feedback. Presenting to the Corrections Planning Board every 6 months was much more data and not a meeting where there was feedback expected to be given in the meeting. So they were different types of reports that had to be written as we went. At the end of that, there was a 5-year analysis, quantitative analysis, conducted by Case Western Reserve University. And that data is disseminated to a larger research audience. So how do I empathize with my potential readers? In order to make an impact with the report, the worker must think herself into the minds of those for whom she is writing, trying to assess the kind of write-up that best communicates to them. Is it it is worth spending time thinking what would be the most effective way or ways of getting the attention of particular target groups of people. This is when you're deciding between a common ground or a disruptor often. We have to pick one. Thus, video may be a more appropriate medium for the local people and counselors than a written report. It is crucial that the language used is appropriate for the people to whom the communication is directed, ensuring that the ideas and concepts are clear and convincing the audience that what they read is relevant to their needs and purposes. Saul Alinsky has summarized all these prescriptions for effective communication in the phrase, always communicate within the experience of your audience. One thing that is blindly clear is when it is a mismatch in the moment. Besides recognizing that there may be a need for varying the medium, style, and content of the write-up for each set of readers, there's also the fact that the communication of the products of the data collection may be archived through different types of report. These include the following types. A data bank. This will comprise the raw material gathered by the worker, including quantitative data and results of observations, focused interviews and content analyses. This data may have to be consulted by the worker and other staff and residents in the future in order, for instance, to make a funding application. It is best to store it on a computer. Working papers. Another possibility is to write papers around each of the major issues or themes that have emerged in collecting data. The worker, for instance, might want to prepare a paper on homelessness, income maintenance, or about a particular estate or set of streets. Feedback papers. Papers might be prepared that provide feedback to those from whom the worker received information or who helped in the collection of data. The feedback might be about the outcomes of the data collection as a whole, or about the specific interests, services, and so on of those interviewed. Popular papers. These might include articles for newspapers, tenants' newsletters, broadsheets, and leaflets that help to disseminate the findings of the data collection to a wider and lay audience. Organizational profiles. In the course of data collection, much information will have been collected about organizations serving the neighborhood. This material can be brought together in the form of profiles of the most important organizations, and these may be useful to the worker and community groups in future relations with the organizations. Survey reports. There may be a case for separate reporting of any surveys that have been undertaken during the collection of the data. For example, surveys on the needs of older and disabled people. It may be advisable to deal with these separately because they may be suitable for a distribution that is wider than the neighborhood or even the particular local authority. Community profile. This is the report in which the worker seeks to present data about the neighborhood as a whole. It may take one of two forms. First, a limited neighborhood analysis. This is a selective presentation of the data, and the selection is made on the basis of some of the decisions the worker has already made about his or her future activities are likely to be. It presents the data that provides evidence either for the worker's preferred analysis of issues in the neighborhood or for decisions taken about possible action. The second form of community profile is more comprehensive. It seeks to bring together in an ordered manner all of the data that the worker has gleaned about the neighborhood. As such, it may be also widely used as a source of data, together with the data bank of raw material. We do not suggest that it is necessary for every neighborhood worker to prepare all these types of report of data collection. To do so would be to give data collection a proportion of field time that may not be justified. The point is that workers are aware that there are a variety of forms of writing up their data and disseminating it, and they should choose more that seem most appropriate in the light of the data and the worker's own circumstances. Nor do we want to suggest that the writing up of data will come to an end at the termination of data collection. There will be many occasions when both workers and groups will need to refer to the data and write it up for some special purpose. In particular, the data are likely to be used to support applications for funds and other resources. The writing of funding proposals, whether to one's own authority, central government, or trusts, is a skilled activity in its own right about which community workers and groups should seek advice before switching on the computer. I'm just envisioning the number of floppy disks that I have completed researching grants on, and just firing up the computer with my floppy disk or my hard floppy disk. Stored on a computer, they say. Ha ha ha. Conclusions. While this chapter has been concerned with the collection of a wide variety of data about a neighborhood, it has tended to emphasize the collection of data that indicate the existence and extent of issues and problems. But the worker will also be collecting information about the resources and strengths of an area, and some assessment of these must also feature in a written analysis of the data he or she has collected. Neighborhood workers have used several methods of classifying information about resources and making it available to groups and agency colleagues. These include plotting resources on maps, the use of resource directories, as well, of course, as computers. There are two other important activities that neighborhood workers are involved in simultaneously with data collection. Making contacts with local people. This is like underlined and bolded and italicized and linked in my mind. Making contacts with local people and developing working relationships with colleagues and managers in their own agency. When I have done over the course of 25 years in various cities, counties, states, and commonwealths, agency or community work, and I say, how do we get help with this issue? And I ask my clients, they give me a name. Usually they're not talking to me about an organization or government office. They give me a name of a person who can help them. So asking people, you're going to learn those names, and those people, those names are going to tell you which organizations they work with and which ones are easy and which ones are hard and which ones are out of the way and which ones fill in the gaps. So relationships. Both activities can lead to early requests for help or the involvement of the worker in agency activities such as membership of an agency working party. Workers have thus to manage their time and commitment in data collection in relation to these other demands made upon them. Additionally, the phases of data collection and making contacts are most frequently described by neighborhood workers as amongst the most stressful and lonely in the whole process of neighborhood work. Nothing will make you feel more like an outsider than people telling you all day long what an outsider you are. Stress, uncertainty, and anxiety about the real or imagined expectations of colleagues and residents about neighborhood work serve to constrain the time and energies available for data collection. We end this chapter by repeating a point we have made several times before. Data collection is not a research project to be pursued for its own sake. It is done in neighborhood work in order to facilitate planning and action. Data collection, analysis, planning, and action are the key and interlocking ingredients of a systematic approach in neighborhood work. At the end of data collection, the worker should be able to prepare an options paper that specifies the actions that might be taken in the light of identified issues and resources. The preparation of a plan of intervention is the subject of the next chapter. Thank you for bearing with me on this 1 hour and 43-minute adventure through skills in neighborhood work. If you're in my course, check your week 2, because we should have some fun links. Everything that I link, I also put in the resources for you to edit folder so that when the weekly content folders open and close, you can still find them. So you're welcome. Whether you're in my course or not, subscribe, like, share, talk about your own neighborhood and communities. And I'll see you soon. Patti Napolitano with Wellness Cleveland.